All right, we'll get started. Good morning, everyone. This is our very first Bereave Manager training. The goal really is to bring managers access to training on a variety of topics that are aligned with the work of Bereave or adjacent to it. We have monthly sessions planned through November as kind of a test, and we would really love your feedback here. This is something new to us, and we want to test it. And if it goes well, we'll bring 8 to 10 in 2025. So we've put together this incredible end of year schedule for the next few months, and hope you'll think it's incredible as well. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being customers, and thank you for the way you've chosen to show up for your teammates, whether that is inside Bereave or outside Bereave in trainings like this. A quick reminder, if you are a manager of a new customer to Bereave and you have not logged into Bereave, please see your HR team to ensure that you have access. You will be able to find this recording there later this week. We will email it as well. And you'll find all sorts of resources and tools for helping your teammates navigate through life's toughest moments. Now, you're here for Stephanie Lemek. Stephanie is the founder and CEO of the Wounded Workforce. Stephanie has spent 16 years as an HR leader across various industries and in organizations ranging from Fortune 500 to growing startups like Bereave. She's now helping companies build trauma-informed workplaces. She's an advisory council member with the Harvard Business Review. She's a podcast host and is a certified trauma support specialist through the Trauma Institute International. Stephanie is based out of Greater Phoenix, as you may have heard, where she lives with her husband, 2 dogs, and her teenage stepdaughters. The chat is open, as you see, and we're going to monitor for questions. We're going to leave Q&A till the end. And if for some reason we don't get an opportunity to get to your question, we will figure out how to handle that in a follow-up email so we don't leave you hanging. Stephanie, we are so privileged to have you here and super excited to learn from you. Going to hand you the keys here and you can drive.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Justin. It is such a privilege to be partnering with Bereave, to have a chance to chat with you all this morning or this afternoon, wherever you are in your day. And super passionate to talk to leaders who are excited in finding ways to better support their team members. So today we're going to be focused on the intersection of burnout, trauma, and compassion fatigue. You might be familiar with some of those terms, and for some of those terms, you might have a question mark. Don't worry, we're going to cover them all as we chat through this. So let's talk about what we're going to cover today during this training. First and foremost, I'm a big definition person. I like to start from a place of shared understanding. So we're going to make sure that we all understand burnout, trauma, and compassion fatigue. We're going to get a better understanding of how these are interconnected and then how they're showing up and impacting your workplace. And then, of course, I'm a big believer in meaningful action. I'm sure you all are as well. It's great to have a sense of understanding around these concepts, but the more we can take these actions with us in our day to day, in our day jobs, the better we do at helping support ourselves, support our team members, and support our organizations. So we'll go ahead and dive in. As Justin said, feel free and drop questions you have in the chat. We'll leave them to the end just for the sake of time. And hopefully maybe I'll answer some of those questions along the way as we're discussing this as well. So let's start with the basics. Let's all get on the same page as it relates to the definitions of burnout, trauma, and compassion fatigue. Let's start with the big one, burnout. And what's really interesting about the term burnout is it's actually been around for quite some time. So it was originally coined in 1974, but it wasn't officially recognized as a health condition, specifically a workplace health condition, by the World Health Organization in 2019. So this was pre-pandemic also. And according to the World Health Organization, burnout is a syndrome resulting from chronic workplace stress, and it's characterized by 3 main dimensions: feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion, increased mental distance from your job, or feelings of negativity and cynicism related to your job, and then reduced professional efficacy. Basically, you're not able to perform your job as well. as you once would have, or you want to be able to perform that job. Obviously, just from this definition, we can tell the impact burnout can have on our workplaces, on our teams, and our ability to perform. And if you're anything like me, you can probably raise your hand and say that you've experienced burnout at some point in your career. So you yourself know that feeling, that kind of crummy, I'm not invested, I'm not excited, going to work kind of gives you those Sunday scaries or that not so great feeling in the pit of your stomach. Unfortunately, burnout is on the rise. And so this is some recent data from Gallup that showcases that 76% of employees are experiencing burnout on the job at least at some point. So burnout is a big deal. And you're probably not surprised to hear this because it's something that we talk about quite frequently when it comes to the workplace. How can we prevent and treat burnout? And don't worry, we'll get to that a little bit later on. But just to highlight a little bit more, burnout creates 22 times worse stress and anxiety than those who are not burnt out. It's associated with degraded employee performance, 32% worse productivity, and 60% lower ability to focus. Apologies that this kind of is hard to read here. We'll make sure you guys have these statistics though in your email. People who are burned out are far less connected to the workplace. And they're twice as likely to feel disconnected from company values, managers, team members, and leadership. If you're familiar, there's a lot of talk right now around loneliness and disconnection. So, burnout and that sense of loneliness and disconnection are absolutely related. And as we think about the bottom line, the day to day of your workplace, burnout is a major driver for turnover. And people who report burnout are 3 times more likely or very likely to search for a new job in the coming year. So, more likely than not, burnout is a term that you're hearing in the workplace a lot. It is the sense of overwhelming stress, it's a psychological stress or injury. And I point that out because the next definitions you may not be as familiar with. And that's where we get into trauma and compassion fatigue. So let's dive in and talk about the definition of trauma. And if anyone has connected with me before or heard me speak before, you have probably heard this definition of trauma. And I'm a big believer of being very clear when we talk about trauma because there's really a wide range of understandings in our society, in our workplaces when we talk about trauma. And it makes sense because our understanding from a scientific perspective has changed greatly over the last few generations when it comes to trauma. So I always like to level set with this because, sometimes people feel like, wow, I talk about trauma and traumatic experiences in a really different way than maybe new employees or Gen Z on TikTok. Those stepdaughters of mine are much more comfortable using the term trauma. And part of the reason is because we know so much more. So if you have a different definition of trauma, something different comes in mind for you, that's okay. That's just showcasing our different lived experiences. But what we want to do as we look at supporting our teams, understanding the connections between these psychological injuries, we want to have a sense of shared understanding. So this is the definition I love to use and I always start with. And it's a slightly altered version of the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, or SAMHSA's definition. Trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that are experienced as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening and that have lasting effects on functioning, performance, mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. You might be thinking, wow, that's a really broad definition. Yes, it is, and very intentionally, because the range of what someone can experience as traumatic is quite broad. And something can be traumatic for someone and not traumatic for someone else. Also, Of course, I have this definition memorized because this is a work I do. But for you, who wants to memorize definitions? So, the easy way to think about trauma when we want to work with that shared sense of understanding, I like to use the three E's. And you saw them highlighted in that previous slide, in that previous definition. So, it is event. So, that is the event that is either actually physically or psychologically harmful. It could be an extreme threat of harm, and it could be an example of severe neglect for a child specifically. So, that event is the first aspect of trauma. The second aspect that we need to kind of define trauma is experience. So, how we as an individual experience that event. And it can be varied from person to person. At the core of that experience is a feeling of powerlessness or a loss of control. And all of the ways we experience something are informed by a variety of factors: our lived experience, our culture, social support, developmental state. So, how old are we will impact how we experience something. So, it's really unique. I sort of hate using this example, but it's a perfect example because we can all really relate to this. When you think about how we all experience events differently and how that can change whether or not we may experience them as traumatic, a great example is the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a single event that impacted the entire globe. And within that event were a wide range of experiences. Some people got very sick. Some people unfortunately lost their lives, experienced lost. Some people lost their jobs. And some people, got to work from home and never experienced severe illness or loss within that event as well. So, that wide range of experience within a single event is a great example of why we have to have the sense of individual understanding when it comes to a traumatic event or experience. And the final E is effect. And so, what are those long term or lasting effects on an individual? And what gets challenging here is that effect can be immediate or it can be a delayed onset. So you could be impacted by a traumatic experience immediately after or several years after. It can be short lived or it can be long term or lifelong impact. And the impacted individual may not even recognize that there is a connection between the effect or the impact and the traumatic event in their past, whether it's the recent past or much longer. And I can tell you from personal experience, this is very true. We may not always have the kind of awareness to understand the effects of prior traumatic experience. So, this is a lot. I understand that trauma is very unique and very individual. And we'll talk a little bit more about why you shouldn't be overwhelmed with such a broad definition when we talk about action. But this just gives us an understanding of the wide range of things that could be traumatic to you or members of your team, and to keep an open mind around that as we approach these conversations, as we approach support for our team members. Trauma is really prevalent in the United States and the world. Probably as you're reading through or listening to me share that definition, you are not surprised to hear this. But at least 70% of US adults raise their own hand and they self identify and say that they've experienced some type of trauma in their past. So that doesn't include individuals who maybe are not connecting with the fact that they've experienced trauma. And even if you are one of those lucky individuals who has never experienced trauma in your lifetime, I'm super excited for you, first of all, but also you probably know someone, care about someone, work with someone, love someone who has experienced trauma. So, this is something that impacts us all, either directly or indirectly. I want to call out a concept specifically as we talk about this interconnection of burnout, trauma, and compassion fatigue. It's really important to understand is the concept of secondary trauma, which is sometimes called vicarious trauma. And it's the idea that there are emotional and psychological impacts from indirectly witnessing or hearing about the traumatic experiences of others. So, this could be something that comes up when someone's exposed to someone's trauma narratives, their stories, graphic details through media, job duties. So, when we think about secondary trauma, probably the first thing we're going to think about is a first responder responding to, traumatic events. But I also really believe we have to take a beat and think about those stories and graphic images that we can all constantly be inundated with, especially with social media. So when we constantly witness or hear about someone else's trauma, it can create secondary trauma, which has a similar impact to a traumatic experience we experience directly. So those images, those stories, those things we see absolutely have an impact. So I want to call this out because that can work in connection with burnout and compassion fatigue as well. So let's finally define compassion fatigue. And compassion fatigue is going to feel a little similar to secondary trauma. It's sometimes called empathetic strain or caregiver burnout, but it is that physical, emotional, spiritual exhaustion that arises from prolonged exposure to suffering and distress. It develops when individuals consistently and empathetically engage with people who are experiencing trauma or emotional pain. Again, this is something we probably think of someone in a hospital or a first responder experiencing compassion fatigue. But I would offer, given the state of the last few years, especially, given the state of kind of the proliferation of images and stories of traumas throughout the globe, we are all at a much higher risk for compassion fatigue and secondary trauma, especially, I would say, leaders, because you are often experiencing and hearing from those you work with, those you care about these challenges as they come to you and seek your support. And I'm going to warn a guest, you're dedicating some time today to talk about this, to learn about this. You are probably naturally a person who's more inclined to care, to have empathy, to have compassion for those around you. So, this is something that absolutely comes up in the workplace, and not just for those individuals who are working in hospitals or schools or other areas we might typically think of. This has been shown to come up in leaders, HR professionals, customer service professionals as well. And all those shifts we've seen, especially recently in our culture, continue to contribute to burnout, compassion fatigue, and trauma. You'll also see there on the screen that these often overlap and they can coexist. They are working together kind of against us in the sense of psychological injury. And so you can think of starting anywhere on this circle. Perhaps you start in a place of compassion fatigue. You've been working really hard, you work in customer service, you hear a lot from your customers, and it's just you're exhausted. Your empathy is exhausted. And then perhaps that feeds into a feeling of trauma or secondary trauma. And all those psychological injuries feed into burnout. And this cycle really perpetuates chronic stress. What you hear often when we talk about each of these is this idea of chronic stress. And that was in our World Health Organization definition of trauma. Chronic stress is very similar to toxic stress. Toxic stress is a real psychological term. So I know the word toxic and stress get thrown around a lot, but these are real clinical terms. And toxic stress is the opposite of productive stress. Productive stress, you might be wondering what that is. You know what it is. It's, you get a little sweaty before a presentation, or, you've got a tight deadline, so that pushes you to get your work done. So you have that little burst of stress that helps you get things done, that helps you protect yourself, that helps you seek safety. Toxic stress is connected with chronic stress in that it's all the time and that your body is always connecting into, I'm stressed, I need to be in survival mode, I need to find ways to keep myself safe, to keep myself secure. I like to call that our lizard brain, mostly because I love saying the term lizard brain, but it is something we don't have a lot of direct control over. And it is something that our body uses as a mechanism to keep ourselves safe. And compassion fatigue, trauma, and burnout all tap in to that lizard brain. They tap into the fact that we are experiencing chronic or toxic stress, and our actions and reactions, we have less control over them because our body is jumping in to give us that sense of safety and security. So we've covered what burnout, trauma, and cr- well, and compassion fatigue are, but let's talk about what it does when we have it show up in the workplace for individuals, teams, and organizations. First and foremost, let's talk a little bit about individual mental health. When we think about burnout, trauma, and compassion fatigue, our individual mental health is absolutely not at its best. I am a big believer when we talk about mental health, we remember that everyone has mental health. It's like physical health. There are things we can do to make sure it is at its peak. And there are also challenges that can result in mental illness, much like physical illness. And there are ways to recover from that. But burnout, compassion, fatigue, and trauma, especially as they tie back into the workplace, can have a serious and significant toll as it relates to mental health. And that can be an increase in prevalence of depression, anxiety, other issues. In fact, burnout itself is a mental health condition. So, really understanding mental health is a great way to kind of help yourself and your teams when you think about, hey, how is work going to get us to a better place? And when it comes to mental health, I am a big proponent of the National Council for Wellbeing's Mental Health First Aid course. So if you have a chance or if you have an interest, it is a great way to get up to speed very quickly on information about mental health, but also this work you're doing right now too, as well. Understanding some of these components over time is also helpful. We'll talk about this a little bit later on, but also don't forget that your individual mental health absolutely counts here as well. The other, sometimes I would say more outsized impact you are going to see when we think about trauma, burnout, compassion fatigue in the workplace is the impact on team dynamics in the organization. If you have ever been on a team and working with someone who's very clearly burnt out or experiencing some kind of mental challenge, psychological injury, that can be very contagious. There is a term that Gallup uses that I am a really big fan of. It is actively disengaged, an actively disengaged employee, someone who is, in fact, either not really helping or working against the objectives of the team, either intentionally or unintentionally. And this can show up in a variety of ways. It could be workplace conflict, it could be behaviors where the individual is not getting work done, their performance is slipping, absenteeism or presenteeism where someone is there but not fully there. These are all things that impact the overall well-being of the team. If you've ever worked with someone whose empathy is drained, like you see in compassion fatigue, that can be, again, very challenging. And so it can be contagious when we look at a team, that sense of burnout or compassion fatigue. And it can really have significant impacts on engagement, retention, and on your overall performance because we know when our teams are engaged, the best versions of themselves, they are going to do much better. So really it is across the board. You have that individual experience. We don't want folks to have, a heavy load. We don't want folks to not be able to bring the best version of themselves to work. But when they aren't able, that expands out into our teams and really can have some serious negative repercussions. We talked about some of those as we looked at those statistics around burnout. So let's talk a little bit more about, so we know what burnout, compassion fatigue, and trauma are. How can we recognize some of the signs and symptoms of these issues in our workplace? So common symptoms can include emotional exhaustion, cynicism and depersonalization, that reduced feeling of accomplishment or purpose, kind of that blah, physical exhaustion or fatigue, decreased job satisfaction and engagement, changes in behavior or performance, reduced empathy and compassion, and that absenteeism or presenteeism. There are, of course, more symptoms, but these are ones that you may be able to see very easily in your workplace. And you're probably noticing a whole heck of a lot of check marks on the right side of the screen related to burnout, trauma, and compassion fatigue. These absolutely can all show up as signs or symptoms of each one of these different senses of feelings or senses of self. And you're like, well, now I'm confused, Stephanie. How am I supposed to navigate burnout, compassion, fatigue, and trauma in my workplace if all of this information, all of these signs overlap? So, how can we figure out what's going on with our team members? I have really great news for you. You don't have to understand if someone is experiencing burnout, trauma, secondary trauma, compassion fatigue. Your role is not to diagnose, your role is not to treat. In fact, I highly discourage trying to diagnose or trying to treat these issues because of why. Well, first of all, we are not clinicians. If anyone's a clinician on this call, I would love to hear from you. But we're not clinicians. We're not credentialed to diagnose and treat these types of mental health conditions. Also, even if we were, we wouldn't do that for our own team members. It's only appropriate for third party credentialed professionals to diagnose and treat burnout, trauma, and compassion fatigue. But it doesn't mean that you don't have a role to play here. Your role is to support your team and yourselves, and your role is to connect to resources. This is important because when you take away having to diagnose and treat these conditions, which is a lot, that can be overwhelming. Even if you ask a clinician, a professional, they could tell you, well, it could be this, it could be that, because there's such an overlap in each of these. You get to step back and understand that regardless if your team member is suffering from burnout, compassion fatigue, trauma, secondary trauma, a really crappy day, it doesn't matter because your role is to support and your role is to connect to resources. And always remember that. And it can feel weird. Like, where can I start? How do I do this? Where do I go? Hello, like, do I have this awkward conversation like, hello, how is your mental health today, Justin? No, what you do is you know your team members, you know your employees, you're invested in these working relationships. And I would warn against most of you are already checking in with your team. You're checking in either formally and informally and seeing how things are going. And that's as simple as it is. Your barometer of your team is to check in and see how things are going. How are they doing? And a lot of times, You all have really hard jobs. They've gotten even harder these last 4 years. A lot of times you can be worried about those questions that you can ask. Am I doing something illegal? Is this appropriate? You probably can do more than you think, but know that you can absolutely ask your team member, hey, how are you doing? Is everything okay? That is legal. That is okay. That is a great practice and understanding how things are going. So know that something you're already doing and being deliberate about it, that's your role in preventing and treating burnout, trauma, and compassion fatigue in your organization. So hopefully that de-escalates maybe some of the stress you're thinking of when you see these broad definitions and all of this overlap. Our brains are complicated, not shocking information. Our brains are complicated. So when we have psychological injury, it is complicated. But what's not complicated is caring for your team and checking in on how they're doing. So let's talk a little bit about prevention and management. I will say, first and foremost, wherever you can start with prevention, that is worth its weight in gold, because burnout, trauma, compassion fatigue are often incredibly difficult to recover from. And for many individuals, it can be kind of a lifelong journey. And this is especially true when it comes to something like trauma, for example. So prevention really is key here. That said, we can't always control how things happen, things we experience. Sometimes we have a new member of our team that comes on board and they're burnout from a previous job. Of course, those, repercussions aren't our fault, but there's still things we can do to kind of help with that recovery, help with that support. So we want to talk about both, but please know prevention, prevention, prevention. I sound like my old doctor back in the day, prevention, prevention, prevention. It's the same thing when we think about our mental health. So whenever I talk about prevention and management around any kind of mental health, I am a big believer that we always have to start with ourselves. It is very, very hard to be the best version of a manager or a leader when we are not self aware, when we are not protecting our own mental health. And also, to have the space to offer support, we have to make sure we're not kind of draining that bucket. You probably listened to that definition of compassion fatigue specifically and thought, I've been there. I know I've been in that space where it's just like continual follow up, continue issues. It's so hard to access that empathy after a while. And you know what? That's a crummy feeling to not be able to rely on that, especially when we are empathetic individuals. So, this is why it's so important that as a manager, as a leader, you're starting with yourself. And I alluded to it earlier, but managers' jobs have gotten really, really hard. And this is why I'm so grateful for organizations like Bereave and other organizations that recognize that and look to find the right tools and resources to get to managers in that moment that they need them so they're better able to support their team. Because when you don't have the right tools and resources, it can be really stressful. And let's think about all the things that have come up over the past year, 5 years. As a manager, you've never had to deal with before. And they kind of plop right on your desk as something to manage. And I talk about this a lot. It's an interesting dynamic, both our changing relationship with work collectively post pandemic. And at the same time, Gen Z is entering the workforce. If we have any Gen Z team members on board or anyone manages members of Gen Z, they have a very different relationship in terms of talking about mental health and seeking support. So, that crux, more likely than not, your teams are coming to you and asking for help. And to make sure you're able to do that, you have to start with supporting yourself first. In fact, data is showing us that managers are among the most likely to burn out. They're the most likely to experience secondary trauma in the workplace or compassion fatigue because of that onslaught of information from their employees or even from your customers or senior leaders. You're kind of squeezed in the middle, and that can have significant impacts. So, what can you do? Check in with yourself frequently. So, we said check in with your team. Same goes for you. If you don't have maybe 30 minutes on the calendar once a week to just check in and say, how am I doing? How am I feeling? Where am I at? I highly recommend that. Even if it's a quick walk or maybe a lunch break, just make that a habit to really check in and be thoughtful with yourself on how you're doing. And ask for help. And this may seem like, oh, I need to ask for help. I need to, get a therapist or a coach. Maybe those are great resources. But asking for help can be as simple as if you have a partner, a close friend, a peer at work that you really trust, ask them for help for recognizing when maybe your bucket is getting a little bit drained, or maybe you aren't showing up quite as the same version of yourself as you always had. This is so helpful because self awareness is tough, especially when we're digging through our days and really want to help support and get a lot of work that we have to do done. So ask for help in that way. If you have someone you trust, go, hey, I'm having a deliberate practice of kind of checking in with my own mental health. I would love it if you could let me know if I seem a little off, or if you could ask me how I'm doing, and I'll do the same for you. That's amazing support to have. And again, it's something so simple that we can do and integrate into our days and weeks. And last but certainly not least is establish a self-care plan. I have kind of a funny term. I say, self-care isn't all green juice and massages. Self-care absolutely can be those things, but self-care is so much beyond that. It's really about understanding your preventative mental health care, how you're investing in your physical, emotional, social, spiritual health and well-being. And there is so much we can do to talk about self care, but I want to make sure that we have time to talk about many other things. So, I actually have a self care workbook. If you scan this QR code, you can download that and use it anytime. What it does is it works you through an assessment of your current state of your mental health, what's going well, what's not going so well. And then it also helps you work through a deliberate plan of action to be more thoughtful and holistic about self care. And yes, there are specific call outs to think about self care in the workplace and in kind of our home or personal lives. Highly recommend you grab a copy. Maybe only one page is helpful to you, but just having a tool to deliberately work through is a great way to really be thoughtful and deliberate about your own self care and not just, someone trying to sell you the latest, greatest new wellness device or, diet plan. There is also a lot we can do when we think about driving understanding and awareness. I started out with those definitions at the beginning of this presentation deliberately because understanding and awareness are huge when we talk about better understanding and supporting individuals. So if you can, share definitions, the signs of burnout, trauma, and compassion fatigue with your team, with the people you interact with, and help normalize that conversation. Like, hey, 76% of people Gallup surveyed said they experience burnout sometimes. So that's probably some of us. So if you continue to have these conversations and help people understand, that knowledge helps with understanding and support. And then I also offer, if you're comfortable, and what's important here is your comfort and your, willingness to share. If you're not willing to share, if it's not right for you, if it's not who you are, don't do it. It only works if it's genuine. It only works if you're, willing to, be vulnerable, share and lead by example. And a lot of times when we talk about this, people think about, okay, I have to stand up and talk about my own personal mental health challenge. I'm Stephanie. I've got to stand up and talk about that I've been diagnosed with depression and anxiety, and I take medication for that. That's true. I would tell you years ago, I would not have shared that, and that's okay. But you know what else is leading by example and being vulnerable is saying, hey, I'm having a rough day. I need to take a beat. I'm going to check back in online later, but I just need a mental health day and sharing that with your team. Or something I did, I had to eventually turn off my Apple Watch in 2020 because I kept getting all those news alerts, really terrible, crummy news. But I remember during that time, there'd be a lot of news stories that were really upsetting. And I got to a place with my team where would say, hey, this thing just happened. I'm feeling kind of upset about it. So I'm going to take a beat. If you need to, take one as well. And what that showcased is that they had an opportunity to take their time and it was okay. So know that find that way to showcase that you're taking care of yourself, you're supporting yourself. Maybe it's I've got my son's soccer game, so I'm going to cut out a little bit early, call or text me if you need anything. That absolutely drives understanding and it drives that sense of I can take the time and support that I need when things are coming up, whether it's, personal things or that mental health. But our lives, our personal connections, our families are also important to mental health as well. So know that that support is really beneficial. Last, leverage available tools and resources. We talked about your role being supporting and connecting to resources. So make sure you know what your company's resources are and have them handy, whether it's your EAP, benefits programs, anything that you have that could be an awesome resource for your team members if they're having a hard time. And a big tip here is to ask. So instead of saying, hey, you seem a little off, here's the EAP, that's not going to probably have the same impact as if you say to someone, hey, I've noticed you've seemed a little bit down. Is everything okay? Would it be okay if I shared some resources with you? And then explain the resources. So asking to share resources, offering to make those connections, providing that sense of choice is really important here. Don't jump from, I think something's wrong to sending the resources. You kind of have to have that conversation, leverage that relationship in the middle. So remember that. But these resources are super handy. We also talk a lot about leveraging internal resources, which is great. They're amazing. There are so many great resources that are available through our organizations, through benefits programs. But you know what else? There are a ton of amazing public resources and really specific public resources as well. So don't be afraid to use those. And this QR code that's on the screen is a very brief list, just kind of a one pager that's in a Google Doc that you can print out or you can save or just have a link to. And here are resources for you for some specific issues, specific examples that are public, that are free, that are confidential, that you can always use yourself or connect a team member to. And last but not least, I love this tip. I got this tip from Catherine Manning. I have to give her all credit for this. Sometimes you don't know where to go for information, and that's okay. You can call 311 for non emergency information to get more information about shelters, resources, healthcare facilities. You can also call 211 for referrals to local mental health resources. So, what can get tricky when we look at public resources is there's a lot of them. So, 311 and 211 can be super helpful in helping find the right thing in that moment. And also, it's hard to remember all of these things. So, if you can just remember 311 or 211, you're able to connect that individual with the right resources without having to know anything. And something that you can also consider, if you're comfortable with it, again, is if someone is dialing a resource, using a resource, you can ask or offer, do you want me to do this with you? Or would you like to do it alone? I would also offer, if someone is exhibiting more extreme mental illness, perhaps suicidal tendencies, acts of violence, of course, leverage your HR team. Also, leverage an emergency number. Contact 911 if it is an extreme emergency. And if possible, when you do contact 911, make sure and ask if someone with mental health training could be part of the response team so they're aware of what may be occurring. Of course, we hope that that never is what we see come up. Unfortunately, it does come up. So for those emergencies, do not hesitate to call 911, protect your safety, that individual safety, and the safety of those around you. Last, this is the tricky one. So sometimes I get a question, Stephanie, if you can only do one thing to improve mental health at the workplace, what would you do? What's the best thing you can do? And what's hard here is it's the hardest thing is going to be the most impactful. And it's looking at the day-to-day experience of work for your employees. How is work experience for individuals? That has an incredible impact on individuals' mental health. It has incredible impact on burnout, secondary trauma, compassion fatigue. And it's a big elephant to tackle culture, to tackle how we experience work. I get that. Incremental changes make a difference. Those small changes, those small tweaks you can make to make the workday better for your team, for yourselves, absolutely make a difference. And what's also great is there are tools and resources that help support this change. Trainings like this through Bereave. The work that I do is focused around shifting culture through processes and the lenses of our 7 principles of trauma-informed culture. These can help you shift culture and how you build processes and really support a culture that supports everyone's mental health and helps everyone be successful. It'd be easy to skip over this because it's really hard and it'll take a lot of time, but it's also the most impactful. So keep that in mind, when you dig in, when you think about culture, when you think about processes, how is that experience maybe impacting someone's mental health? And if you are interested in learning more about trauma-informed cultures or our 7 principles, feel free to reach out to me, find me. I love talking about this, and certainly willing to share more information there. Last but not least, just ask. If you're worried about someone, if something seems off, just ask. Just check in. How are you doing? Is everything okay? Is there something I can do to support you? There is so much amazing work that's happening around better supporting employees and mental health at work, and it gets me so excited. But I also think because there's all this information, all this training, it can become intimidating for managers and leaders to go, oh, I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to do the wrong thing. The most important thing that you can do is show up in a genuine way and care for your team members. So just ask the question, just check in. And I promise you that is going to be more impactful than you can ever imagine. And don't be afraid to do it. Like I said, how are you doing? Is everything okay? Is there anything I can do to support you? Those are natural things for you to say as a leader. So don't be afraid to do that. And before I jump in and we answer some additional questions, some Q&A, I want to leave you with this quote. It is something my favorite yoga teacher ends every yoga session with. And I think it's really important when we talk about this here because we talk about starting with self. But may the kindness we wish to see in the world begin with the kindness we extend to ourselves. So please remember, this work is so important. And clearly, because you're here, you are focused and dedicated to creating a better workplace. Remember that workplace is for you as well. So make sure and take care of yourself, support yourself. Thank you so much. And let's open it up for some questions.
Stephanie, that was awesome. Thank you so much. And that last quote, to see it, be it, or, starting with the man in the mirror or whatever it is, it's just like, I love that so much. And I think if we look at ourselves and what we're doing and how we're showing up, I think it can have a major impact on the people around us for sure. There was one question specifically from Daphne here in Indy. She asked, what can a person do during their workday when experiencing fatigue?
Absolutely. This is such a great question. So not to heavily plug that self-care workbook too much, but there's some great work there for you to think about what things you can do when you're having a hard day. And I also am a big fan of what things you definitely shouldn't do if you're having a hard day. So if you're experiencing fatigue during the workday, I would recommend thinking about the things that help give you energy. Can you take a walk? Can you quickly have a phone call with a friend, or grab a coffee, things like that? I'm also, if it's something where you're kind of experiencing that compassion fatigue or emotional fatigue, a grounding exercise is really helpful. And if you're looking for grounding exercises, we can send a follow-up email with some. But Googling grounding exercises, they're very simple. It can be as simple as a breathing exercise. There's a exercise that's really helpful. It's, name 5 things you can see, name 4 sounds that you can hear, 3 things that you smell, kind of going through and bringing yourself to that present moment. Experience with what works for you when it comes to that self-care. I'm a big believer self-care looks different for everyone. I probably seem like, very in touch with myself. I ended with like a quote from my yoga instructor. I can't meditate. I tried so much, like I can't do it. My mind runs and wanders. So for me, the thing that helps me be mindful is I actually once a week I arrange flowers for my entryway hall. And that is my little bit of mindfulness and self-care. So experiment with those different things to find that. And Daphne, if you or anyone on the call, if you experience kind of fatigue at the same time every day, maybe put a recurring appointment on your calendar that is just kind of a quick break for you, whether it's to go for a walk, to get away and do a coffee break. Make sure you have that time set aside and really honor that time, because that's going to help you with your fatigue. But again, that's a great way to lead and showcase that your team members can take that time they need for themselves as well. Amazing question. Thank you.
It's awesome. Jenna has a question. When you see a team member struggling and you share resources,
Mhm.
how can you continue to support if they don't utilize those resources? Essentially, is there a way we can help them help themselves?
Yeah, this is a really tough one. This is probably the toughest situation, and I mean we've all probably had this, where you kind of can lead a horse to water, but you can't get them to drink. And so I think there's a variety of things you can do. Keep checking in, keep asking. It may feel awkward. It may feel exhausting, like I'm kind of tired of checking in, but eventually maybe something will land. And if nothing else, you're showcasing to that individual that you care. So continue to do that. If it's becoming an issue that's impacting the workplace, the team, you're concerned for their safety, I would say this is a moment to escalate. And I recommend escalating to your HR team internally. If you don't have an HR team, if you have a leadership team and perhaps they can leverage legal counsel, this is a moment to escalate. And do so thoughtfully, because it can become contentious. But there are some options. So something that is an option is something called a management referral to EAP, if you have an EAP program. And what that means is you're requiring someone to connect with the EAP. This doesn't mean that you get to hear anything they talk about with the EAP. It just means that the EAP will let you know that they've completed this, they've checked in, they've followed up, they've connected with those resources. And I would say these are things where if maybe someone is abusing substances at work, or if someone is exhibiting, behaviors that are concerning from a safety standpoint, I would say that's when to use it. Or if it is impacting the workplace, so policy violations, performance issues, things like that, I would say you can leverage that management referral. If you're concerned about someone's physical safety, so if you're concerned someone might be suicidal, Um, Again, this is where I'm going to really plug mental health first aid, because you actually practice saying, are you considering committing suicide? Um, which is, it's a weird thing to say. Trust me, even as I say it, it's hard to say, but that can help you understand. And in those moments when someone is, violent or potentially having suicidal thoughts, that is a time to just tap in emergency services. It doesn't feel good because someone is experiencing a crisis and they may feel or exhibit that they're betrayed, but really making sure they're safe and they're able to live another day and have chances to move forward is really important. But again, I would say if it's not an emergency, I would say just offer persistently. And if you get to a point where you kind of feel like you're talking to a wall, maybe say, I've offered these resources a few times. Is it helpful for us to keep, discussing this, or would you like me to stop? And kind of offer that choice, offer that conversation. Um, that is my best recommendation, kind of checking in and leveraging your support, your resources. It's really frustrating to offer help and not have someone accept it. So make sure you're leveraging your resources to feel supported as you're looking to support that individual as well. Great question, Jenna. Thank you.
Fantastic. Stephanie, thank you so much. This was incredible. If you're
Amazing.
interested in learning more about how to create a trauma-informed workplace, we'll be sure to get you Stephanie's information along with this follow-up and this recording by the end of the week. This recording will be found in the Bereave platform, so it is yours to access as needed whenever you log in. She is available for a deeper dive, available for hire for a deeper dive on building trauma-informed workplaces. Next month, we're going to have Sarah Hines, who's the CEO of Grief Advocacy, on the topic of leading through loss. That's going to happen on September 10th. We've talked to Sarah on another program live before, and you will not want to miss it. More info to come on registration through your HR leaders, and you will also be able to do that through the platform as well. Stephanie, thank you so much. We'll
Thank you.
talk to you soon, and everybody else, until next month, be well.